the PowerPoint now, the slide. Yep. Trying to use multiple desktops here on Windows, so hopefully this works. Let me just join quickly in here and see. Works all right. Great, we ready to kick off? Yep. Hello, Raz, anyone else? We good to go? I think I need to change my device settings. Just give me a second. Right, that's better.
That's great, Rishi. Yes.
Sorry,
All good.
sorry, I couldn't hear you there. I had it switched to a different device on the speaker. Great, thanks, Raz. So hi everyone. Thanks for joining today. So today I'm going to be talking a bit about some admin tips for Power BI. So just a very high level around governance, and also going through some of the things that Hashim looked at in his earlier session around sharing. So I'm going to look at how you distribute internally and externally. So just a little bit about myself to start with. So I work as a senior consultant at Altius, and last month we got acquired by Avanade, which is a joint venture between Accenture and Microsoft. I'm a data platform MVP and a chartered accountant by background. So my background's actually not from a kind of BI or IT background, but from accountancy. Worked with kind of the big four and some of the big investment banks, and I do it with the community stuff that I do. So I've got two kind of main communities that I run now. So one is Power Platform Finance, which I just put a link to. It's just powerplatformfinance.com, and that's where we're doing a lot of financial reporting stuff. So there's a session on Thursday, a webinar by Andrej from Zebra BI, who's one of the gurus with data visualization, especially in the finance area, but they build custom visuals for this kind of stuff. And Learn Data Insights, which is a relatively new site. I mean, it's been going for a while, but I've kind of officially put out some comms around it, which is focused around Power BI, Excel, and Python. And for the Power BI stuff, I've put in there some quizzes for the new DA100 exam. If anyone's interested in looking at doing those, I've put up some quiz questions, and I sat the exam last week. So it's a good exam. I think actually I would recommend it to people. What we want to cover today. So let's say a little bit of what to cover, of how and what to govern around Power BI, and then looking at internal and external sharing and collaboration. So if we start with kind of Power BI governance, as I say, this is a very, very big area, and it's something that I do with a lot of clients. So I work with a lot of clients where they've big organizations, hundreds of thousands of people. They've rolled out Power BI, and then they've just got this huge estate of Power BI assets. So workspaces, reports, dashboards, all being created, being used, shared by whoever, with whoever, and not really, there's no real governance or understanding of what's happening in the estate or what the right approach is. And it's about getting that balance between self-service, so allowing people to go in and be able to create content as they want, and also being able to have control of governance whilst not making it a bottleneck. What you don't want is self-serve BI is very much that middle ground, right? So back in the day, there've been two types of reporting. You've had IT-driven authored reports. That's the stuff that IT build and they distribute out to the rest of the business, and that's your business objects reporting and lots of things like that. Crystal reports back in the day, and then you've had those are secure. They're governed. They're managed. They've got a lot of control behind it. But then on the opposite end, you've got Excel, which is the complete opposite. It's very flexible, it's very agile, which the IT audit tools aren't, but you've got no control, no governance around it, all the rest of it. So things like Power BI is very much that halfway house between those two, between Excel and the IT other systems. So it's about trying to get that balance with Power BI. So, you could go too far one way or the other. If you give people too much control and flexibility, just like Excel, and then you will end up with Excel hell or Power BI hell. And if you lock it down too much, then what will happen is people won't end up using it, and they'll end up going back to using Excel to do analysis and reporting, and you won't get that kind of adoption. So in terms of what you can govern with Power BI, there's three main things. One is the access to the content. So the content in Power BI, think about how that needs to be managed. Second is access to functionality. So that's from Power BI Pro license, what you can do with that and who gets that, as well as who can use premium functionality and those things in the tenant settings, the admin portal that Hashim showed earlier. And then lastly is around the operating model. So we're going to have a quick look at these three. So in terms of access to content, so one of the things we want, so content, as Hashim was explained before, is in workspaces. So dashboards and reports are hosted in workspaces, which are containers within Power BI, where people can access content. And workspaces are also where apps are published from. So content lives in workspaces and is distributed through apps. So what you want to be able to do is manage who those workspace admins are. So those workspace admins are able to essentially control who has access to that data. And if you tie that into your operating model and identify those users in your organization who are able to who know what they're doing in Power BI and have that level of experience with it, then those are the community of people who you really want to be your workspace admins, as your gatekeepers for that content. So that's one of the things about controlling access to content. What you could start to do is separate out your environments. If you're using premium, then actually maybe that shared environment is less controlled, less governed, and people could be workspace admins of that. Whereas for your premium instance, you might want to control that a little bit more and control who is going to manage those workspaces, and make sure those are the people that know what they're doing with that kind of content. As we alluded to before, both Hash and myself, apps are a really good way to do distribution. So what you want to be able to do is, rather than sharing ad hoc with lots of people, we want to use apps, and we'll come onto that in a few minutes, and use row level security. And that's where apps with row level security really work well together, because once you define those row level security roles in desktop and assign them to the data sets in the service, then those will be respected when you distribute the app. And apps are really the best way to do distribution. And finally, we want to use Azure AD groups. So there was a question earlier about how to create Azure AD groups. So if I just switch over to a window in here, so if we just go to portal.azure.com, and then in here, we can go into Azure Active Directory. And on there, we can see users and groups. So two ways of doing it. One is through the Office 365 that Hashim showed, and here we can look at groups and we can create new groups. So if we wanted to create a security group in here, we can call it Dynamics 365, and then we can add members to the group. So we can search for people and add them in, and then they will show up in Power BI. And AD groups are really important for controlling access. And the reason those are recommended over just adding individuals is because it allows you to reflect that structure. So when people leave the organization, or if they leave teams, those should get updated through Active Directory, and then their permissions are always up to date. So you're not relying on someone to manually go in and change workspace access and think, right, someone's leaving, I need to be notified of that. I need to know which reports they should have access to and which they shouldn't, and which row level security roles need to apply to them. If that's managed through groups, it will make that much more governed and much more easier to manage. You are also able to, sorry, can everyone still hear me okay? I'm hearing some beeps in my mic. I don't know what that's related to. Is everything okay? Yep, hello?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
Okay, good, okay. Right. So yeah. So as your AD groups, absolutely good reason to use those. Good way for you to govern it. You can also query Active Directory using, say, the Graph API or using PowerShell or using something else. So you're able to get that view of the AD groups that exist across the business and who has access to what. And there's things you could do around also workspace creation, for example. So again, what you might want to consider is that in your premium instance, maybe not everyone can create a workspace that will get assigned to premium. Maybe for those, you actually have to lock that down and restrict who can create workspaces. You can't do that specifically for premium versus um, shared environment because the tenant admin settings apply across both. But what you can do is start to think about whether you want to lock down security groups or to particular security groups. So AD groups are used for two things: one for access to content and one for access to those functionalities in the tenant settings. And then access to functionality. So for premium, you really want to control what's hosted on your premium environment. So this is looking at what functionality is on premium. So people get premium for, I mean, the main benefit of premium is licensing is one of the main things, because with a premium instance, if for any content that is hosted on there, people can view it without a pro license. So you can have a free license and you can view that content. I see a lot of organizations who don't need that still acquire premium. So a lot of organizations I work with have actually gone down the route of purchasing Office 365 E5 for everyone in the organization, and that includes a Power BI Pro license. So then they don't need premium for the licensing benefit, at least not for internal users. So even then, the other benefits of premium are things around more control, more accessibility over what's going on underneath the hardware. So even though it's dedicated hardware to your own environment, so you can see more about what's going on, and you have access to more premium features. So things like paginated reports, things like AI and an enhanced compute engine for data flows, which we'll have a look at later. There's a few extra functionalities, more refreshes, bigger data models, and Power BI Premium's essentially becoming that analysis services. So premium will become a superset of analysis services. So analysis services is where the data model that sits behind your Power BI reports are hosted in a server rather than being hosted within a PBIX file. And we can achieve the same thing with Power BI by hosting those data models separately. And it allows you to have much more control, have multiple developers over them, have application lifecycle management. All of these kind of features are in or coming to Power BI Premium. The challenge with it is that what you don't want is just to load lots of reports into your premium instance, because one of the challenges we see with premium is that actually, even though there's a perception that it's going to be more performance, that's not necessarily the case. You see clients who will buy premium because they have poor performing reports, they move them to premium and they actually become worse, because even though the hardware is dedicated to you, you haven't got noisy neighbors of other customers, Microsoft customers in the same tent, in the same environment. You've got the problem of noisy neighbors within your own environment, within your own company. So actually what you want to do is really restrict what goes onto premium, make sure there's valid use cases for whatever's put on there, whether it needs access to premium functionality specifically, or if it needs the ability to be able to be managed. And maybe if that's business critical data, then you could look at managing that in a premium instance. But everything else should be on shared and will probably perform better on shared. It's really only if you limit the number and actively monitor and actively manage your premium instance that you'll be able to improve performance. The next thing is around going through your admin portal settings. So this is kind of what Hashim was showing earlier. So if you're Power BI admin or you have access to Power BI admin, you can go into the admin portal and tenant settings. And for many of those functionalities, and there's a list of them on Microsoft Docs website, I can put a link to it in there. Most of them are enabled for the entire organization by default. And one of the recommendations is to actually restrict most of them to a subset. And even if that subset is quite big, even if there's lots of potential Power BI developers, then you could restrict it to those. So that raises the question of, well, how do you identify who to restrict this to? So even if I want to restrict this to all Power BI developers, how do I know who they are? So there's different ways to do it. So for example, if you don't have Office 365 E5 and everyone has a pro license by default, then you could do it through a pro license. So people who request a pro license will be the content developers, and you'll need a pro license for them to be able to create workspaces or publish to workspaces. So that's how you can then identify those, and then you can set up some system, an automated system using Power Automate or something like that. That basically, once someone requests a pro license or is assigned a pro license, they can then get added to a security group that will then give them access to the functionality that they require via the admin portal. So most of what they need to do, they'll be able to do with a pro license. There's some settings in there in the admin portal that you might want to restrict, and the extent to which you restrict those, whether you restrict it to people who are super users or people who are just content developers, or if you leave it open to everyone, all of that is kind of a governance choice that needs to be made with the security team. And so that is operating model. And this ties in very well with those last two sections around governance, because one of the things we really want to be able to do is tie up access to content and access to functionality with personas and profiles of people in the organization. And that's really how the operating model works. So what we can see here is a picture of a kind of belt system, and there's lots of different variations of this. But what this entails is putting people into a category depending on how they use something like Power BI. So at the bottom, you've got red belts, and that's the bulk of the organization, which is where most people sit. And those are pure consumers of content, pure end users. You've then got green belts, who are a little bit more analytical. So there's also consumers of reports, but they'll tend to do more drill through and exploratory analysis as well. You've got blue belts, who are Power BI developers, but not necessarily have learned M and DAX to the nth degree. And so, are not necessarily going to want to do all of that data ingestion, data cleaning, data modeling. And that's where you've got then, but what they can do is, if they've got pre-built data models, then they can build visualizations of those and actually answer those kind of business questions using the reports. So you can start to separate out some of your responsibilities around development. And this is where things like shared data sets, which we'll come on to, comes into hand. Your black belts are those people who would work very closely with IT and understand M and DAX and data modeling and all of the complexities that go around that. So even within, so this is all kind of business roles, and you can look at how those personas lay up and look at that from a licensing perspective, but also an operating perspective in terms of roles and responsibilities. And then through that, you can define an approach to say, well, actually, what happens when we have a new requirement? How do we get this into a centralized data model? How do we make sure we build these centralized performant data models that can be reused across the business? And center of excellence, probably heard that term bandied around a bit. For me, what that means is you've got competency centers. So center of excellence don't necessarily build. You've got competency centers around the business and different functions or units who will be responsible for development. And those experts, that community of experts, are served through a center of excellence. So the center of excellence is that kind of conduit between that community and IT, and making sure that community has what they need, and that each team and function are doing things consistently and in the right way. So you have approaches that can apply across the board, because without this, what you end up having a lot of organizations is different silos. Different teams will do things in their own way, and then you'll start to have lots of different data silos across the organization. And that is definitely a big challenge for a lot of organizations, but having a center of excellence model helps you to be able to put that in. And the last point on there is kind of make sure you train everyone. So including end users. So a lot of people assume that, Power BI is very intuitive to use. You can just roll it out and everyone will know how to use it. And unfortunately, that's not the case. So, even end users, I think there needs to be training around how you're supposed to interpret data, how you're supposed to use the visuals, what these things like cross drill through, cross filtering, all of these aspects of Power BI need to be educated on, and building that up, and then identifying what level people want to get to in terms of technical understanding or involvement in the technical side, you can deliver through the operating model. So I appreciate that's quite a whirlwind tour of what is actually a very, very long topic, but I'm just curious to see, are there any questions before we move on to kind of ways of sharing? Any questions on the chat so far? Right, okay, zoom into components. Yep, sure, I could do that. I've actually connected my to a different app, but I'll do that as I go forward. So actually, the other slides are slightly structured in a slightly different way. But what I'll do is I'll share these slides afterwards as well. So what we're going to do is look at internal sharing, internal collaboration, and then external sharing and external collaboration. And I'll go through these again quite quickly because we've covered a lot of it before in Hajim's session, but also the idea is to just understand where everything fits in for a big picture, then go into the details to why you might want to use one or the other. So for sharing, so what we can see here, this is what actually was showing before. In here, what we can do is on any kind of given report, they've actually just completely changed how the workspaces look overnight. So we could go into share here, and this is where you've got ad hoc sharing. So we've got those options to be able to see can people who you share it with share that on with other people? Can they build new content? And typically I'd say no to this. I would typically uncheck this. We'll come on to what this is in a minute for shared data sets. And you can specify whether you want to send an email notification to them as well. So this is good for kind of one-off sharing or ad hoc sharing. So for a few individuals, probably not for entire groups, even though you can put security groups in here. It's more for that kind of one-off sharing. Have a look at this. Not really for distribution. Once you've shared something in this way, and you can see, by the way, who things have been shared with, and you can actually kind of remove the permissions. So those links become inactive. Once you've shared it with people, when they go into Power BI, they'll see it in the shared with me. So then they could go into there and see the content that's shared with them. So that's one way of doing it. But as I say, it's really just for one-off kind of ad hoc sharing. You've then got apps. Now, apps are the way to really distribute content. And so there's a one-to-one relationship between workspaces and apps. And this causes challenges for a lot of people because they say, well, actually, I've got a whole bunch of apps, but I need different groups to see different combinations of apps depending on their roles and things like that. And it seems to be duplicating effort to publish the same report to multiple workspaces in order to achieve that. So there's a few ways around that. One is to potentially use something like OneDrive to store your files, and then you can have one file and one report in there. So when you go to get data in here, you can upload a PBIX file from OneDrive, and then it's that single location. So you're not creating multiple copies of that report. You're just creating any modifications or creating different versions, saving that as the OneDrive file, and then it will get replicated into those multiple workspaces where you've got data. The other thing to do is to make use of things like shared data sets. So at least if you've got different reports in the same report in multiple workspaces, at least if they all have the same shared data set behind them, what you're able to then do is utilize that data model that's common. And even if the reports are slightly different, or even if they're the same kind of reports for different audiences, there's not much overhead for those reports, because those thin reports, which are based on a shared data set, it's just visuals. It's just a bit of JavaScript code for how to render those visuals. There's no logic, there's no data in those. So at least you're not managing the overhead of all of those in different workspaces. So in order to be able to produce an app, you could go into the content. So let me go to one that's actually got something in it. And we could go to publish app, or this case, say update app. So first you go in, and as Hajim was showing, you select which ones you want to include in the app. So you don't have to have everything that's in your workspace published as an app. You could then give it a name, a description. You can set up your own branding, so your own logo and colors. You can also define your own navigation, and here you can add custom links. So if you have things like training material that you want to include a link to or embed almost within here, you could do that through adding those links. So you can add a new link, and it can be to whatever you want, to any website or anywhere else. You can also set up how you want to navigate between the different report pages. You might want to appear them in a different order or have different reports and show those through. And then permissions, and this is where then you can either publish to the entire organization or to specific groups. And again, here is where AD security groups should be used. So AD security groups could be used here to distribute, and then also if you have row level security and you assign roles to those groups, again, assign roles to groups so that you use AD security groups to do this, so that everything's managed through those same kind of groups. And again, this is a setting that you can disable in the admin portal, whether you want to allow people to publish to the entire organization. You can also have this option, which can be enabled or disabled, which is around installing this app automatically. So you don't have to, when users want to access the app, rather than going into apps and get apps, they'll see it straight away in their apps folder. Again, this is something that you can choose on the admin portal, whether you want everyone to be able to do this or only certain people. So the challenge with this is that potentially this has potential to be misused. If people are publishing lots of apps and pushing them straight out to end users, then even if they're not relevant to everyone in the entire organization, then when people are going into their app section, they'll see lots of apps that aren't relevant to them. So that's why that's important to manage that. Again, we probably want to uncheck this, allow them to use the underlying build permission, because I'll show you actually how we use shared data sets again to do this. And as you covered before about allowing users to make a copy of the report. So typically I would uncheck these boxes, because for me the app is just about distribution. It's a way for you to get that content out to a wide audience. Say with all of the benefits of the custom navigation, of the staging. So as you say, with apps, when you update content, you'll need to physically go and change it. But where there's data that's updated, which is every time it's refreshed, that gets reflected automatically in the app. So the point is, if you make a change to your report, you've almost got that staging area where you can validate it before clicking an update app. What a lot of people do as well is actually have different apps for different stages. So for dev, prod, and test, and that's also an approach that could work quite well for that. Let me just see if there's any questions before I move on. Sorry, yeah, thank you. Were there any other questions? So do we use analytics to determine the personas user types? Potentially. So one of the things you can do is use activity logs. So Power BI has activity logs. They're also traditionally part of Office 365 activity logs, but Power BI have their own that you could access as a Power BI admin without having to be an Office 365 admin. That is something you could use to be able to identify who's using Power BI, who's doing certain types of activities, who's creating workspaces, who's creating publish to web or doing embed codes. That is a way to do it. And in a large organization, that's probably not a bad way. I mean, you need to manage that between the overhead that you want. Right. So apps, we've got read-only consumption for large-scale distribution. You grant access preferably via the AD security groups and also apply row-level security. And you've got your custom branding and your navigation. For apps which haven't been pushed to them, users need to go to apps and get apps, and then modified or new content will require the app to be updated. So the two roles within a workspace that can update an app are admin or member. So there's top two roles there. The other way of doing internal kind of sharing is to be able to embed it in SharePoint Online or in Teams. So one of the things I see here that people miss quite a bit is that you can create the link to embed in SharePoint Online, but in order for them to be able to see it when they go onto the SharePoint site, they still need access to the report. So if they don't have access, that report wouldn't load for them, even if they have access to the SharePoint site. So what's important to do as a first step is firstly, not do it through My Workspace. I've seen that a lot as well, where people would just publish an app to My Workspace and then publish the URL from there. That's not really a way you can do that because they can't get visibility or access to that report from My Workspace. So what you can have to do is either push it out to the audience through an app. And this is potentially one of the use cases where you might do entire organization if that SharePoint is generally accessible to everyone, or you add them as a viewer role into the workspace that you create. So that can't be My Workspace, it has to be a group workspace. Once you've done that and you made sure that everyone who you want to access that report has access to the report via one of those methods. Then in the report, you click on Embed in SharePoint Online, go into SharePoint, create a Power BI web part, and paste in the URL. And then that report will be there on SharePoint Online. For Teams, it's a little bit simpler even. Again, you need to make sure that people who in that team have access to it. And the way it works at the moment, at least, is that when you create a team, it also creates a Power BI workspace, a V1, an old workspace, which is an Office linked to an Office 365 group. So those workspaces also have Office 365 groups, so you can potentially use that workspace to share with the team and people have access. One thing to be aware of is that that link is going to break at some point because Microsoft are migrating everything to V2 workspaces, which don't have the Office 365 group connection. But leaving that aside, groups is an interesting area, but leaving that aside, once you make sure that everyone in the team has access to the report, then in Teams, you just add a tab in the Teams channel and navigate to the Power BI report, and then that report will show up in that team, in that channel. And this is a really common and popular way to start sharing now that we've seen, and it works very well because you can also have that whole conversation about the report and everything else with it within the Teams chat. Even though you do have the commenting function in the Power BI service, this is potentially another way to do it that works quite well. So those are your kind of three methods for internal sharings. You've got ad hoc, you've got apps, and you've got embedding in SharePoint or Teams. Any questions on the internal sharing on that at the moment? Nope. Okay. So now we look at internal collaboration, and this is where it starts to get really interesting because we're differentiating between sharing distribution and collaboration. So collaboration, and this is really where workspaces come into it, is where you want to collaborate with other content developers. So you want to be able to work with other people on developing content and making that available to people. And that's really the intention behind workspaces, even though obviously, and also as a staging area for apps. So accessing content directly in workspaces is intended primarily for collaboration. So there didn't even used to be a viewer role in a workspace. There is now, and if you are a viewer role, then it's essentially like having your app distributed to you in the sense of it's a read-only consumption. You don't really see the data behind it, and row level security will still apply. But for those non-viewer roles, none of those apply. So you can see the underlying data sets, which is not the case for apps. Row level security doesn't apply, which again defeats the point of adding people into the workspace for that way. If you've got row level security, because it just doesn't apply in that situation. And it's also, they see everything in the workspace, not just the stuff that you've chosen to publish as an app. So that's why there's that distinction between apps and workspaces in my mind anyway, that really apps should be used for distributing, workspaces is for collaboration on content. So we've got here then membership to workspace is via AD groups, at least in the V2 ones, or as named individuals. And this is what you could do with the various roles. So anyone apart from a viewer can create, edit, and delete content and publish content. So really, these are the roles that it's for your content collaboration. You can add viewers into the workspace, but then why not just do it as an app instead? Yeah, bear in mind, row level security doesn't apply, and all non-viewers can see data sets as well as reports and dashboards. So to publish and update an app, you need to be a member. Admins are the only people who can add or remove people from a workspace. So this is what we're really saying, actually, these are your kind of gatekeepers for your content in Power BI. So if you want to start with governance, start thinking about who you want to be able to manage those workspaces, who are going to be the gatekeepers to that content. And one thing we'll see with data flows and shared data sets is actually workspaces can be used to control access to those as well. So then you have gatekeepers of your data sources. So shared data sets and data flows, and this is a really, really interesting topic. It's where we're starting to look at how, the reason I've put this in internal collaboration, because It's how we can reuse data sets, reuse data tables, reuse the logic that we've got in there. So your DAX measures, your data models, how they could be reused across different departments, across different reports, and different reports for different audiences. So you might have the same data being used in lots of different ways by different teams, by different individuals. And actually what you want to do is not have to redo all of that work every time. So you want to encourage reusability, both from a efficiency perspective, so to not have to do rework, but also from a consistency perspective, because what you want is to have consistency across the organization. You don't want to have two reports based on the same data source that show different numbers, because there's slight difference in how they've been calculated, and if that's unintentional, that's not good. So that's one of the reasons that you want to have this kind of single version of the truth, as it says here. So what we're able to do is use shared data sets and data flows to do that. So data flows is sharing the raw kind of tables, and they can be clean, so you can have all your data transformations applied to them, but they're kind of data tables. There's no DAX logic in there. There's no row of security roles. There's no relationships. It's those kind of those raw table entities. That's data flows. If you want to share the entire data model, so things like the DAX calculations, the relationships, that entire data model sits behind a Power BI report, then that's where you make use of shared data sets. So we'll start with data flows. Data flows, so the real advantage of data flows is that rather than setting up those connections and having each time your Power BI data model refreshes hitting that data source and being able to having to refresh that and hit that data source each time, and also having to give credentials for people to connect to data sources. So what you could do instead is have them set up centrally in a data flow and give people access to that data flow. So when they're building reports, and rather than connecting directly to say a SQL server and then bringing that data into your data model, doing transformations and cleanings the same that the person next to you has done in the other team, doing all of that again, bringing it into your data model, you can actually just connect to a data flow. And your access to that data flow can be managed through workspaces and AD groups, rather than you having to set up all these different accounts for every Power BI developer that needs access to it on a source system, or using generic or shared credentials, which are obviously not advisable from a security perspective. So for both security and performance reasons and consistency reasons, data flows are a really good idea to try and use. So to create a data flow in the Power BI service, we just go to a question. That's what the beeping I was hearing. Right, admitting people to lobby from the lobby. Is there any questions? No. Right. So to create a data flow, and this is just changed. So bear me a second. Where have they moved it to? New data flow. So once we go to new data flow, what did that not do anything? So once we do new data flow, we can look at these options. So typically what we would do is define new entities. One of the things with data flows is you can start to use them to drive more enterprise reporting. And I've got a video on this that I've done on YouTube that goes into more detail about how data flows work with the various different flavors. And I'll come back to these in a minute. But to start with, we define new entities, and we can connect to the same kind of connectors that we see in Power BI Desktop. So this is really that get data screen in Power BI Desktop brought online in Power BI Service. And we can't connect to things on our computer because this is using Power BI Service in the cloud. So if we want to connect to anything on premise, it has to be via an online gateway, an on-premise data gateway. But we can connect to anything cloud-based. So even if we select Excel file here, we'll need a data gateway, or it needs to be hosted, say, on OneDrive or SharePoint Online. Once we've done all of this, we come up with a transformation window, same as we do with getting transformed data. And actually, if we've got our queries in Power BI Desktop, we can go to Advanced Editor, copy and paste the M code, and then paste it into here. And by and large, it should work. There are some slight differences, some slight nuances, but for the most part, that's your way to bring those online, and then everyone can reuse them. So this is a really good idea for things like date tables, which you'd use across multiple reports, multiple data models. You can set them up as a data flow, and then multiple people can access them. And then once you set up a data flow, you've got access to, you could manage it like a data set. So you've got the refresh schedule, same exactly like a data set. You've got access to it, and people, when they in Power BI desktop, they can go to get data and they can connect to Power BI data flows. And that's where they'll see all the data flows that they have access to. And again, if data flows sit in a workspace, then by managing access to the to the workspace, you can manage who has access to that data. So again, it's another way for you to be able to separate out that data, centralize it, and control access to it in a more centralized fashion. So let me just switch back to the slides. So centralizes the activity. So the three options of data flows, and I'm not going to go into this in a huge amount of detail here. As I say, I've done a separate video on data flows and these options. But the default one, I guess, is when you go to define new entities, is you have that web interface for the query editor online, and that's by default. When you create that, the question comes about as to where this data has been stored. So it's going and fetching that data, say from a SQL server, and then it's storing it somewhere to make it accessible to Power BI. So it's not having to keep going back to the database every time to get the data. So where it's actually been stored is in Azure Data Lake Gen 2. And by default, it's in a kind of hidden instance of Data Lake. So you don't access it. When you create a data flow, it writes back to that data storage, and your data will be there, but you don't directly access that data lake. There is an option for you to go and specify your own data lake that you want to be part of this, and there it will write back to that data lake from a data flow. So then the idea is that you can use Power Query to clean and transform your data and conform your data, and then use those cleaned entities for other purposes. So you might have data scientists connect to it to be able to do their own transformations on that clean, conformed data. The third option is where actually you can have your data sitting in Data Lake and actually use Azure tools or whatever it is to be able to get your data in the shape that you want in for BI reporting in your Data Lake, and then just have that consumed by Power BI. So Power BI is pure consumer of that, and this is done through mounting a data flow. And in this way, you can't edit the data flow in Power BI service. So you can't have any control over it, and it's just Power BI as a pure consumer of it. And again, this is probably the most enterprise way. And you could have all three options within the same tenant. So it's not about choosing one, but you choose one per workspace, or at least per data flow, and then you can have a combination of those. So it's a way for you to be able to go from having, more self-serve driven, and maybe for some entities and some things that go on, you have them more governed and controlled, and Power BI consumes them. But for all of those use cases, you can still use data flows for it. So just to recap a little bit on this, data flows are created within group workspaces. You can't create them within my workspace. Uses Power Query online, and you use define new entities to go there. Connect to online data sources, or you can copy and code from the query editor in Power BI Desktop. You could also apply transformations using the UI and then create the data flow. And underneath there, you can go in and set a refresh schedule and manage that as a data set. These data flows then become a source. So in Power BI Desktop, you go to get data flows, and you can see the data flows there, and then they become a source for the data models. So the data models then become their own data sets as well. So bear in mind, there's not intrinsic link between the two. So when you refresh a data flow, it won't automatically go and refresh all of those data sets that are based on the data flow. That's still a process you'll have to do. You have to sync those up manually at the moment. Right, before I go to share data sets, any questions on data flows? Nothing? Okay. So shared data sets are then, rather than sharing the raw tables, or if you like, the tables be loaded into the data model. Shared data sets allow you to share the entire data model. And what you can do is share that data model with users who are building reports on it, and then they can publish those reports to a different workspace. So this is what I say is one way to be able to manage thin reports in different workspaces, but have them based on shared data sets which sit in a kind of centralized repository for reports that are all based on those data sources, and have centralized data models. So it's very good from a consistency perspective, very good from a kind of performance perspective, because you want to have those data models that are optimized, that are built well, and then multiple reports feeding off them, and also from an efficiency perspective in terms of not having to do rework. So in terms of how people can get access to shared data sets, so when you to use a shared data set in Power BI Desktop, you just go to Get Data, and you go to Power BI datasets. So what this does is creates what's called a live connection. So when you connect to a Power BI dataset in this way, you no longer see these two windows. All you see is the visualization pane, because all you can do is create visuals of it. You can't do any modeling in the sense of you can't even see those measures that are in there. You can access them to use for reports, but you can't see the DAX behind them. You can't edit the data models. What you can do is create local measures. So if you have particular measures that you want to use for your visualizations that are going to control how something displays, or for conditional formatting or things like that, you can create those measures, but they'll be local to your report, so they're not going to be built in to the data model. So it's a way of connecting to data that's where the data model is already built. So the data model will sit in a PBIX file. So you might even decide to build a whole data model and then not have any report visuals in it, and publish up that PBIX file to a workspace to be used as a shared data set. And then anyone who has access to that data set can then go in to Get Data, Power BI datasets, and just build their own visualizations, their own reports on top of it. Now, in order to be able to get access to it, so to be able to see that shared data set when you go into Power BI Desktop, if you're a member of that workspace with at least a contributor role, then you'll have access to that data set in there. So actually, that's again why workspaces and AD groups are a good way to be able to control access to data. If you're not in the workspace, you can get access directly by clicking on data sets, going to manage permissions, and then adding people or groups into here. You can also, as we saw in the other two options, when you do ad hoc sharing or when you do apps, you can also assign build permissions to the people that way. To be honest, I think that's not an ideal way of doing it, because I think it's much better for it to be more centrally managed, and it'd be good actually maybe even a tenant setting to be able to turn that off. But so yeah, recommended ways I think to manage it through workspaces. That way your workspaces are your source of content that you manage access to. We've then got developers connect to them, and we can see actually some of these have certified, and there's also promoted. And this is promoted, anyone can promote a data set, but certified, you can restrict it to who can certify data sets. So you can do that again in the admin portal. One of those is who can certify data sets, and the default I think is still that everyone in the organization can do it, which defeats the point of certification to a degree. And so again, that's one of the settings where you'd want to potentially have that restricted to a subset of super users in the organization. Developers could then utilize these, so they could add local measures, and then the reports could be published to different workspaces. Bear in mind, you still need to grant those people who in the workspace that the app has been distributed to permissions on the underlying data set. So again, that might be ways where if you don't want to add them to the workspace, either you could add them to workspace as a viewer, and they'll still have access to that, or you can to read the data set, or you can add them on the underlying data set. So there's a few little nuances to do with that. Just this is kind of a diagram that I took from an article on Blue Granite, which is looking at how you might have data sets, data flows, and data sets sitting in their own workspaces. So you have your corporate data where you have data flow, sitting in there. So a date one, employees, these are commonly your dimensions. They then, there was Marco's session earlier, they then go into, so they sit in their own workspace and you control who has access to that by who has access to that workspace. The shared data sets then also sit in their own workspace, and those shared data sets use the data flows. And then they also go into other workspaces, which reports are built off. So this is a report that's just linked to this data set, and this is distributed to an audience. This is a separate report or set of reports that are distributed to a different audience, but also based on the shared data set. And even though you've got multiple reports here, and you ideally might have thought, actually, can I not just combine these into one workspace and publish them to just control who accesses it? This is quite a neat way of doing it, because you've got these as separate workspaces, but they're all based on a shared data set. As I said, there's minimal overhead with these because they're just visualizations. They're just thin client reports, no data model behind them. We've got a few minutes. Any questions on that, on shared data sets? Does direct query mode support data flows? Does it have to be input mode? I think at the moment it's still input mode, although I did see on the roadmap that direct query is coming. It said April, so I don't know. I don't know if that's been delayed or not. Actually, it'd be good to try that. But yeah, I think definitely it's coming if it's not there already. It's in public preview, I think, at the moment, direct query for data flows. So external sharing, I'm going to go through these very quickly because I'm quite conscious of time, but there's a few ways now to then, the main thing is obviously internal, how you share within your organization, how you collaborate with others. So there's a few options for how you can do things externally. So as your AD, so we'll go through these for sharing. As your AD B2B, so basically all of those methods that we looked at for internal, so ad hoc sharing, app distribution, and workspace. Oh, let's go with apps and ad hoc sharing. You can do with external users. So they need to be added into your Active Directory. So by default, if it's set to, there's one of the settings in the admin portal is that people who can share externally, and by default that's everyone in your organization. So what that means is that when you go to ad hoc sharing, you can put in an external email address there. What that will do is it will automatically add them into your Active Directory as a guest user once they and then when they sign in, they'll be able to see that content exactly like they were a guest user. By default, this is read only. So it does link in with Active Directory. The people do need to be in your Active Directory, but if you do an ad hoc invite like this, like you share with an external one, then it will do it that way. The other way to do it is actually to do it planned, where you run a script or you do something to be able to add them into the Active Directory separately, and then they'll come up in that people picker. And actually, that's probably a better way of doing it, again, because it's a bit more managed. You can go through that process of saying, right, I want to share this with external people, making sure that's okay to share with external people. And also the other element of that is licensing. So they need to have a Pro one. They can use their own if they've got in their own organization, or if you've hosted the content on Power BI Premium, then they can come in as a free user and view it. So by default, this is all read only. There is an option to make it read write. So that's external sharing. So again, it's kind of almost out of the box functionality, but just be conscious of what it does behind the scenes and the licensing implications of it. Publish to web. So I see this used a lot, misused a lot, because this is where you can basically create your report, publish it to be accessible via a public URL. So anyone with that link, or anyone who could find that link, will be able to access that report. So there's no security, no authentication, nothing that goes behind it. And obviously that could be a large potential security risk if it contains any kind of sensitive data that you wouldn't want to have public consumption of. So again, this is one of the settings that could be restricted in the admin portal, who can publish to web. Defaults everyone. You probably want to look at restricting that to a subset of people who have a genuine use case for it. People do have the impression that that URL is secure enough because it's no one who shouldn't have it will have the link. You can actually go in and scrape the web for them and find them, which someone did a few years ago. Dave in Mark's colleague in Netherlands. You've also got then external sharing through Power BI embedded. Now, this is where you want to really create a portal for your customers. So say that you're a bank and you want to provide some reporting for when the customer logs into the online banking portal, they can see their transactions, spending history, and all the rest of it. And you want to use Power BI for that reporting. So what you can do is embed the Power BI reports into your online banking portal. And then it's also applies through Active Directory and row level security. So when they go in, they'll see a Power BI report essentially rendered in your own portal, and it'll be for their own data. So this is a way for you to kind of really share that externally outside of the Power BI environment on your own portal and your own app. And it works with, it's very, very powerful. See a lot more kind of demand for this because a lot of companies are becoming data companies, providing a data service to their customers and using that as a differentiator. So this is kind of pricing details. Again, it's a big topic. Have a look at something called the Power BI Embedded Playground, and you'll see examples of how those are embedded. It's a bit more developer heavy. To do that, and the last couple of minutes, just look at external collaboration. So external sharing, we had Azure AD B2B, we had Publish to Web, and we had Power BI Embedded. And then for external collaboration, we've got the option to be able to give people create and edit rights using Azure AD B2B. So this means they can be added to workspaces and publish content exactly like an internal user with a pro license. So again, this is one of the settings in the admin portal. We've got allow external guest users to edit and manage content. And it can be specific. Those specific external users can be added to a security group, and that will give them that capability. We've also got this idea around template apps, and this is more for software vendors. So if we Altius have built a tool, a Power BI report that connects to a standardized data source, say Google Analytics or SAP, then we could build an app that will take those users' credentials and allow them to use their own credentials to connect it, but we give them a ready-built report, ready-built dashboard, and they can't go in and download the PBIC, so we're protecting our IP in that way. So that's the idea behind template apps. And then lastly, we've got using Power BI Embedded. One of the features you've got in there is things like personalization. So you've got things where people can create their own visuals on the fly using the data set, and where you can have export data APIs to be able to control who can kind of export data from. Right, I'm just conscious we've got a question here. What's the best solution for managing reports and dashboards from different departments? So the idea behind dashboards is that it does absolutely come from different reports. So if you've got multiple reports in a workspace and you want to, the idea of the dashboards is you can take tiles and visuals from each.
Hey Rishi, you're on mute.
You hear me?
Yeah, you can hear you now.
Right. Sorry. Did you hear what I was saying about different reports and different workspaces? Yep.
Can you please repeat this now, please?
Yep. Sure. So what I was saying is that ideally, so dashboards is where you can have use multiple reports, different tiles and visuals from different reports into a single kind of pane of glass, single page view. So that's where dashboards really come into play. So they don't have to be, if you can have different data models, different data sets behind those, as long as they're all in the same workspace. So anything within a workspace you can pin to a dashboard. And then for the idea about having different apps for different audiences and having the same reports repeated across them, comes back to the previous point. Either use something like OneDrive so you're not repeating files, but also have a look at using potentially shared data sets where you can then have single data sets and have thin client reports that are based on different apps. I've got a few links here as well. So this is for the Power BI adoption framework. So this is a YouTube series that be done by two guys in Microsoft UK, Manu and Paul. Really, really worth checking out around governance. There's a Power BI white paper on planning a Power BI enterprise deployment. This is a little bit old at the moment, but I think a new one's coming soon. Melissa said on a webinar a few weeks ago that they're in the process of finalizing a new one. And this is a really, really good white paper. So I'm really looking forward to that. Altius Data Lounge. So we've got a community YouTube channel called Data Lounge. There's one that one of my colleagues did on admin portal and tenant settings, which was really good. And there's one that I did a few weeks ago on data flows, pre-lockdown, obviously. And then here, this is something we've got for governance around an app source. So it's an offering around governance, if that's something that you're interested in. As I say, it's a very big and very important area. So I'll give you a minute to. Are there any other questions quickly? I know, so I'm conscious we've just ran a couple of minutes over. Are there any other questions, Raz or?
Thank you, Rishi. I think that was a very comprehensive session. So a round of applause to you, Rishi. Really, really impressed. So thank you so much for that session.
No worries. Sorry, just to come back on Stephen's point very quickly, to export to PowerPoint. So there is an option for exporting to PowerPoint in the Power BI service. It's quite limited in what you can do. It won't respect all the different bookmarks and views you've got. You can't really use custom visuals in there. There's a few limitations. There's a new option now to be able to copy and paste a visual. And what that will do is copy it as an image, but it will be a linked image back to the report, which is still slightly better. There's also third-party tools. So there's something called Power BI Tiles, which allows you to embed kind of live Power BI reports inside PowerPoint. Great. All right. Well, thanks a lot, guys. Great to see some names here. Thanks a lot for the comments. And